AEW is coming out soon with their own wrestling game. More than 50 wrestlers in the initial roster, 40 weapons, 400 plus moves, and exploding barbed wire matches up against WWE 2K23's safety net of continued numbered sequels in what feels like the thousands by now. Can AEW compete? Wrestling is a game genre decorated like a grave with consistent failings of multiple attempts to regurgitate the same content with a number after it, pretending that it's new. Yet, arguably, a good wrestling game has finally dug itself out in WWE 23, which has improved a great deal from prior years. AEW is trying to steal that belt with a new game for a newer organization, even if some of their roster reads like its own resurrection list of older wrestlers creaking around like dusty skeletons. As a huge wrestling fan, I'm excited to see if a new game with a mix of old and new wrestlers offers something better, or at least in competition with WWE's consistently safe outings. I buy a copy of every game I review, even if the dev gives me a code, and I give it away to commenters. AEW wrangles up 9+ modes and event types, and while possibly not fleshed out in the depth as its competition, there's enough here to keep a wrestling fan tied to the TV, deciding if the entire game is a work or a shoot against their own wallet. You can instantly jump in, heading out into modes like exploding barbed wire, ladder, casino, 1v1, as well as tag teams and 3 and 4 ways, picking from the roster of over 50 stars from the AEW organization. Or you can create a character and dive in. And that's where the first big split in all these wrestling games come up. The normal game, in which you dive in with all of the normal roster and your own created characters. Creating a wrestler in this game has a couple presets, as well as you able to dive in and adjust all kinds of stuff like height and weight, as well as some presets. And then you have moves attached to directions and grapple locations that you can switch around or just go with the general that it comes with right away. Each of those characters can also get extra slots for finishers and signature moves as you get extra points from going into matches. I will say that I wish there were more overall looks you could adjust. I wish there were more items that you could put on your character, because while you can adjust your in-ring as well as your out-of-ring attire, it did feel pretty basic until I started buying stuff from the game shop. Also, kudos to them. They have about 500 moves as I counted it up across all of the different buttons that you can press, as well as directions, and that's if you count rear attacks and rear grapples as well as front and more. The game shop, as I said before, is where you spend the points you've earned, though it's not necessarily as stacked as it may initially look because they're within different categories. And AE Fight does allow you to do that. It has that full creation suite that's, aside from the wrestler themselves, allowing players to create their own entrances as well as their own arenas, both to somewhat detailed lengths. But the bread and butter of AEW, like so many wrestling games before it, is the career mode once you've created a character. This is entitled Road to Elite, and that lets players take their own created wrestler through the schedule. Each week you take 4 actions, 1 per night, like eating out or gaining energy, going out to sightsee, or signing autographs to raise your momentum for a later fight. You can heal at the hospital if you've hurt something, in a match, or during weight training. All of those actions you take usually have a positive and a negative, whether that be points and money that you get, or a little bit of energy you burn, or in the case of weight training, the ability to possibly hurt yourself. Nice thing about this is it always tells you what the percentage of that is. This is also when the backstage stuff happens here. Random morning talk show interviews, story beats where different characters interact with you. AEW has a pretty good system here, at least when it comes to its basic steps, but it is not polished technically, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. It still moves the story forward with you meeting other wrestlers, being asked if you want to join different groups, backstage backstory moments, and a full assortment of treacherous people that you're going to meet. Now, in-game wrestling is a mix between arcade and sim-like, depending on which part you're engaging with at any particular time. For example, the game has a very noticeable punishment system for performing identical moves over and over again. And I like that. Depending on the difficulty that you choose, it would punish you more or less quickly, depending on the opponent you were fighting as well. It has a tight window for reversals, which is a little bit more arcadey for both attacks and grapples. And when you mix in the movement, the chain wrestling, as well as just the ease of pulling off the moves, it does feel like a quarter muncher, and it's not a problem. Each face button has its own matched ability, sprinting, high and low attacks, as well as grappling. For an easy grasp of the moves, with the bumpers being used to block or evade grapples, you can jump into this game pretty much instantly. And that's the grandiose part, and the part that always pays off in wrestling games. It means throwing someone 8 feet across the ring and then leaping into the air and thundering your leg down onto the neck like you're trying to see what happens if a man is personally punched into the core of the earth. AEW, like every other wrestling game before it, delivers astonishing looking damage to the stars, even in some of the most basic moves. feeling like Injustice Light as you powerbomb someone into the concrete. Each match also has you slowly building up momentum while damaging the other wrestlers, and each star can accrue damage to body parts as well as injuries if the beatdown is hard enough. Then you can start performing more and more complex moves. First, just your normal body slams and suplexes, of which there are a good amount to choose from, but then also your finishers and signature moves with the camera cutting to make it look more epic each time. Depending on the match, pinning someone or throwing them outside the ring will win. At least it would in real life, or if wrestling wasn't a complete absolute shoot show. It's crazy skills and wrestlers getting themselves up or buying a skill yourself to break out of initial pins or reverse specific moves that adds to theatrics here. That's also when a lot of the noticeable problems shoot up, pretty much anytime you get in the ring, because it's like a Goldberg wrestling match. No matter how good it was or may have looked, someone always got broken or something was always damaged or just went off a little bit. In the matches, it always feels like the game's got a ring IQ of a damned rock. The game's AI and collision detection merged with some of these other issues really hurts it. And that even comes up in some of the moments in the longer matches. I've seen lung transplant patients with better gas than these dudes. And I get it, Ultimate Warrior would gas out just running to the ring, but that makes sense when a 280-pound dude sprints 60 yards and then spends the first 20 minutes shaking the ring cables. Here, you just walk out, but even the more Lucha Libre-style characters have dog-ball-level lung capacities. And in a large fight with many characters in the ring, watching them all huff and puff like they smoked a redwood worth of pot with Snoop Dogg and can't just move around isn't great. Waiting for the character to miss you or try to attack you and then not really realize where you are, because for extended periods of time, the opponents will just target and then untarget you. And a lot of times, you're just going to see the AI stand up and start swinging out into the middle of nowhere. Now, one part of the game I did like is the upgrade skills. As you get points for wrestling, you can upgrade 3 paths of skills, including learning how to leap off the top rope, as well as gathering more eclectic skills. Most wrestlers enter into wrestling with the basic skills above this, so while it isn't necessarily realistic, it does actually make the first series of skills and upgrades you get feel very momentum building as a player, as well as the ability to move before the bell or get gained momentum if you strike an enemy first. These are just some of the options, and I haven't seen a lot of other games where it feels that impactful, even though, again, as I said, a little bit unrealistic. I do wish that the game had more generic special moves and abilities, though, because while the stars are represented here with special dodges and moves that are right for their repertoire, many a character ends up falling very flat when you create them. Generic moves and taunts and evasions and specials and finishers mean that they don't feel as memorable. They feel a little bit like Oz before he was Big Daddy Diesel. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, well, that's how your character may feel. And these inconsistencies, added with a couple others, means it can feel really wishy-washy as a game. For example, the actual referee takes time to get over to you to start the count, which is fine. But that means getting started and smashing the buttons is something that you can actually do when you're pinned. I have no problem with that. But in other matches, like barbed wire matches, this is an actual almost instant count because no referees in the ring, which feels arbitrarily cheap, even if you're on the winning side. Collision detection is also like watching a bunch of old Tom Brady's trying to tackle, just like dead bodies shocked into momentary movement and then thrown out into the void. I think that's a place that we've seen issues in other games, but it's really noticeable in AEW, probably because they are going for a slightly more mature rating or more mature feel, but it really can't get going because a lot of the characters can't get over you to attack the person they're trying to attack in, let's say, a 3 or 4 man show. And you have bats and sledgehammers and electrified rings, but it doesn't take a ton of advantage of those, or when it's trying to display them, it just really doesn't hit. I think that's a major mispoint for the game, a real opportunity lost to reflect more of what they're trying to do with AEW. Luckily, you also have various online types that you can play as well, including casual matches and private matches. So if you want to jump in and play against somebody else, you can do it at pretty much any time. But one thing you should never do is assume this game is going to look incredibly good. If gameplay's king, the graphics in AEW are somewhere around Court Administrator. It's rough, goofy, but it sort of makes sense in this particular aspect. For a game based on cocksure muscle-bound athletes fighting it out in a small ring with rubber bowling baby bumpers, it reflects it pretty well, but in a more arcadey look than we've seen in the WWE games. The lighting system is more reminiscent of last generation, as is the design of the characters, whether created or from the stars themselves. It's got a plastic wrestler toy look to it versus a real person. And you would assume at these lower levels it would run well, but as it is the game on a 4090 with a current i7 at 4.9 and 64 gigs of RAM, the game actually can get pretty choppy at different times. Strangely enough, it's not during the very busy times. It can just be at a moment when you have 2 or 4 characters in the game and you're doing some kind of battle royale or just a 1 versus 1, and the game just decides to get really choppy at those particular times. Speaking of choppy is the audio presentation. Many characters, and in fact large swaths of the game, have no voice, just stiff bodies, low poly chunk heads babbling it out in silence at some local Five Guys in one of the cutscenes. It really does harm it, because this is a point where I actually think delivering those lines would have been much more realistic in an AEW game and have them deliver the more mature style. Voices are pretty bad. Even the actual character and announced voices sound recorded from prior events, possibly and sometimes from a recording booth, but alternating in the same moment with very little actual mixing. And that problem is no easier dissected than the many meetups you have in the career mode with a ton of characters from the roster, many without any voices, just staring over at you as you eat some clams and threatening you. Music in the game takes many of the tracks from the wrestlers and what appears to be a number of generic rock and roll and hard rock tracks, but for a game like this, and really honestly how often you're going to hear the music, I think that part's fine. When it comes to the audio samples, they're actually pretty good. The mat slap sounds, the different moments that you throw somebody against the ring, or just hits that you do, all sound good. Unfortunately, the explosive barbed wire timed down sections where they have an explosion after a specific amount of time are very low and crunchy and sort of all shoved together in the low frequency spectrum, and that actually caused it to sound really, really messy when it went off. Overall, I would say the sound samples are pretty good for what you're getting. But speaking of pretty good, does all this come together to elevate it beyond when it comes to fun factor? It's got a ton of options that are excellent, but it also has a ton of little problems. It is fun. The game's like a raft, though, with too many people leaning to one side, and it starts to teeter-totter. As more AI gets into the game and more wrestlers begin interacting, that's actually when you should look at this and say, man, this is an AEW, it feels just right, but instead it falls apart. The AI seems to almost sample fewer times per second the more characters you get in, and its decision-making prowess takes a massive hit, swinging and kicking and leaping, but instead, because the game builds this magic fucking column of impassibility above your character, it just happens into the air above you. This is something we've seen in other games, but as a newcomer into this, I would have liked to have seen them try to figure out a way around it. Instead, what you get is just a mess of swinging and kicking between 3 AIs who seem to be all fighting for the last invisible fucking biscuit. And though it's hard to expect much more from a game that's mimicking a sport where people do get into a ring encircled by electrified barbed wire, I would have liked to have seen them try a little bit harder in some of these parts. AEW is not going up against WWE. It's just not. It's more arcadey. It still has a good number of modes and a somewhat robust character creation system. It's got some interesting upgrades as well. I cannot say that enough. I liked some of the skills that you could unlock, even if they weren't necessarily identified as realistic when it comes to what a wrestler would understand when they went into the ring normally. And that means with those issues and the inconsistencies, though it offers a lot, I would rate this game a wait for a sale. I hope you guys like these videos. If you do, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumbs down. It isn't a premium game. It is at a cheaper price, so be aware of that if you decide to go into it, even though my rating is still based on that cheaper price. I hope you guys enjoy it. Peace out, and enjoy the rest of your week.
All Elite Wrestling's Dynamite is on the air, and we are sold out in Washington, D.C. This is episode number 1, the start of a revolution in pro wrestling.